Hey folks, and welcome back to COVID Chats. My guest today is the formidable Amior Schmidt. Amior is a good friend of mine, and I was concerned when I learned that he had contracted COVID-19. Thankfully, he has recovered well, which you'll hear all about and more. Now, on to episode 20 of COVID Chats. Hello, Mr. Schmidt, and welcome to episode 20 of COVID Chats.
Hello, Mr. Dryblad. I didn't realize you were so prolific with these chats.
Yeah, well, I've been doing my best, trying to get them out there, trying to get the content to the people. It's a pleasure to have you on
Thank
for
you.
a number of reasons. Have a bunch of different angles to explore, but really the first and foremost is the fact that you actually had coronavirus, COVID-19. So I'm wondering, how are you, and how are you feeling now?
Thanks for asking. You didn't check in on me until I was on your show. No, that's not true. For the viewers, Ruben did check in. So it's been 5 weeks. It's been a bit of a journey.
Absolutely.
Luckily, nothing that I ever experienced through the course of this in any way put me into a life-threatening situation. I was fortunate not to have to visit the hospital.
Mm,
I was fortunate not to have at any point trouble breathing. It was and it still continues to be a set of various kind of physical symptoms. It started with a sore throat. Then I had a fever, some body aches, a cough, diarrhea was the big one, which people don't talk about. But if you read up on the literature, it's one of the huge symptoms of this thing. I won't say that I had that, but many have experienced.
of course, you didn't have diarrhea.
Right. My stools are very solid.
Excellent.
And after a week, my fever broke. That's the point when I got tested. Luckily, at that point, they still had tests for non-critical people.
Mm,
And I got tested that week. This is now 5 weeks or 4 weeks after that test.
wow.
So already on that test, I was starting to feel better. My fever broke. What was worrying, though, was that there were a lot of reports of people getting worse in the second or third week.
Right.
So I really was not sleeping easy those weeks. I mean, every night I was going to sleep and saying, tomorrow you'll be a day closer to hopefully the end of this. But it's very scary to feel fine and then to read up on people, within 6 hours going from feeling fine to not being able to breathe.
Right.
And so every symptom kind of felt like, oh shit, is this going to be the point where, everything just stops working in my body?
Mm,
It was scary. Like I said to you when you did check in on me at that time, it's probably more scary to be fearing all of these things happening to you without even having the virus.
mm,
Because there's a lot of worry about the virus and how it might affect you. And, obviously sitting at home and not having been diagnosed with COVID, you can read these horror stories and still be very anxious.
absolutely.
And in the third week, my lungs actually started to hurt a bit more. I started to feel some pain in the side of my ribs. And at that point, I was still experiencing very light fevers, 99.2, not very heavy.
Sure.
But again, I thought this is it. Like, this is the reckoning. It's been 2 weeks since, and now I guess my lungs are going to fail. And luckily, I called a doctor, and he basically said he spent 2 weeks in the ER with COVID patients. What I was experiencing was not at all the lethal aspect of the disease. He said the big thing to look out for would have been a much higher fever. Some people, like Boris Johnson, for instance, he had a very high fever for 10 days.
Right.
99.2 is troubling to me at home. It's not troubling to the medical community.
Right. That's fine.
But what he said was that my lungs essentially were hurting from inflammation of having fought the virus.
Mm,
So it transitions. Initially, I had a drier cough, which I guess is a symptom of irritation due to the virus. And I'd like to say now I have a wetter cough, which supposedly would be kind of mucus clearing to get rid of the antibodies that are in my lungs.
mm,
It's a very subtle difference. I don't know, but the point is that it continues to evolve and to manifest in different ways, even though at this point, I'm likely well over it. And what I'm feeling, I have been getting better over the past week since that kind of dipped down.
mm.
And what I'm feeling now is much more likely just kind of manifestations of the fight that my body had with it.
Right.
So again, extremely, extremely fortunate that, at no point, even when my lungs were hurting, I would describe it as they felt a bit spicy. sometimes in the abdomen, right below the chest, sometimes in the side of the ribs,
Mm.
sometimes in the lungs, up here in the chest itself.
Mm.
When it happens on the left side, I say, oh shit, my heart is stopping. When it happens on the right side, I say, okay, maybe not. So again, people ask me what's the worst symptom. For me, the worst symptom was the paranoia.
Mm.
And had we lived in an age, and I often think it's interesting to wonder what it would be like if we didn't have all this medical science.
Yeah.
And basically they say, you're either living or you're dead. And I wouldn't have really worried so much. I would have said, oh, I have a bit of a cough. Oh, my lungs are hurting. I'm still alive. But knowing what it can do is the very worrying part. And then you look out for every symptom. And it's kind of like Teddy Roosevelt, nothing to fear but fear itself.
Mm.
Like the fact that my lung feels a bit spicy when I breathe, it's not really causing me much physical trouble.
Right.
But it's the fact that it's a new symptom and all of a sudden it makes me think that I'm on the downtrend.
Right.
And so those weeks were tough. I think at this point I'm 5 weeks past contracting the illness.
Mm-hmm.
So I hope that it should be pretty smooth sailing. I'm still taking things easy. You mentioned the pan flute, which I do play.
Yes.
I can show that briefly to the audience in case they're unfamiliar.
Yeah, show it off.
Looks like this. It makes sounds. I haven't been playing that too much because I'm trying to go a bit easy on the lungs. I haven't been doing too much exercise.
Sure.
And the doctor said it could be many weeks that I'll feel kind of a bit tired and weakened by this because it is an intense virus. It hits everybody differently. I think that one of the things I've read is it hits you differently if it ends up descending deeper into your lungs or not.
Mm.
So even a healthy person or a frail person, their outcome might be affected based on kind of just where the virus travels.
Mm.
Which is totally luck. If you've seen those boards where you drop a penny and then it can kind of go to the left or to the right 10
Yeah.
times. So it's chance. The virus might end up kind of migrating deeper into your lungs. And that's, in my case, what I believe happened, which is why I felt the aftershocks.
Mm. And yet you
So,
still caught it relatively, early in terms of, how bad it was getting. I'm wondering, like, when did you first sort of realize or suspect that you think you had it?
so going back a number of weeks,
Yeah.
things in February were starting to get a bit tense. I work in Soho, and I was taking the one train every day downtown from the Upper West Side to Soho. And it was a tense train. I remember even in the weeks before any official shutdown started, people were talking about the virus.
Yeah.
And at that point, they were just saying, wash your hands, don't touch your face. I was going to the train and I was standing in the corner if I could.
Mm.
And, it was very interesting to kind of see everyone like, this is New York. Everyone's on this train because they have to get to work. No one really wants to be on the subway. No one's riding at 9 a.m. on a
I'm
weekday
thrilled
for
about
fun.
it. Yeah.
And they're all sitting there, and like no one has masks at this point. No one's aggressively sanitizing. I actually bought a small pocket-sized hand sanitizer from one of those street newspaper stands because I wanted to eat a bag of gummy bears. I was waiting for a friend, and I bought the gummy bears, and I said, wait a second. This was during Corona,
Right.
like
Right.
the build-up. I said, wait a second. I just got off the
Sanitize.
subway. Why don't you sell me some hand sanitizer too? And this was before the runs and anything.
Sure.
And it started to get a bit tenser as we were reading up on the news every day. I went out for drinks with coworkers on Friday.
Mm.
I don't recall exactly which Friday, but basically that Friday the implication was things might be a bit hairy after this point. Let's just enjoy the last look at normalcy. And then that Monday, Mayor de Blasio said, if you're able to, you should bike to work. So that Monday I biked to work. And I looked at the weather for the coming week. I said, it's not going to be so easy to bike to work on Tuesday. So I brought my laptop home
Mm.
and I worked from home for that week, which was very, very nice, actually, because I'm a data scientist. The work I do is mostly through a computer and can be done remotely.
Right.
And I live with my parents. I'm a recent college graduate for the audience at home. That week was very nice because my parents still were going to their offices and I was basically working from home, coasting. It was a very relaxed atmosphere.
Right.
And then the next week, my parents all of a sudden started working from home and the home office became a lot less attractive.
Yeah.
So this was all about 6 weeks ago. That
Mhm.
Monday, I was feeling okay. And then the next Monday was that Monday meaning the one where I biked to work.
Right.
The next Monday was the Monday where I came down with the fever.
Mm.
And as fevers go, it was pretty mild. I did feel body aches, which was a bit suspicious. I don't normally feel that. And I had a fever of about 100, 100.5 at the maximum.
Okay.
I had a dry cough. I kind of rested for a few days. I self-quarantined myself best I could for my family. That Friday, the fever had cleared up. I was feeling fine. I was able to put on a mask, walk around the reservoir. And that's when I got tested, and that was about 4.5 weeks ago.
Mm.
And that's been the progression of this thing. So I'll say for the week before I came down with the fever, I did feel a bit of a pain in my throat.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of had a suspicion, like, okay, maybe I'm coming down with this.
Right.
Luckily, I was able to get tested, and that brings us into something that we've talked about privately in depth, which is the fortune that I've had to be able to have been tested for this, and now to be able to, they don't know exactly how immunity works, but it's much better to be in my current position, I feel, than to be in a position of someone who is, wondering, did I have it? Was, in February I felt a bit sick. Was that it? Can I still get it? Will I still get it? What will happen if I do get it?
Right.
So it's not something that I would necessarily have chosen to have gotten.
Right.
But it does put you into a bit of a relief.
Sorry, you broke up there for a second, but you were talking essentially about the relief that you can have by knowing that you have it, as opposed to having the uncertainty around it, which I completely understand. I mean, certainly the stress response that I have day by day, knowing that I don't have it, but very well could get it at any point, is tremendously taxing.
And I think for a lot of people right now, the paranoia is the worst part of this entire situation.
Absolutely.
Not just about corona, but about, maybe you're healthy and strong, but you're worried that your grandparents will get it, or you're worried that a frail sibling or a parent will get it, or you're worried about losing your job, or you're worried about, for a lot of people, I think the uncertainty and the worry is one of the worst parts of this whole crisis.
Definitely. Especially if you're in a household with other people, because then it's like, oh, they might spread it. I could spread it. I could get it from them. There's so many more people to be accountable for. So I want to talk further about this, but I want to do a little bit of a conversation shift here, because it's 7:00.
I hear.
Right, as you hear. So, you're a New Yorker, I'm a New Yorker. In New York at 7 p.m., people make a lot of noise to celebrate and pay our gratitude for the healthcare workers. I know you had a little bit of a different feeling about it, so I'm curious to hear that for you. And I will do a quick blast of the shofar, because that's what I've been doing at 7 p.m. But I wanna hear about how you feel about this.
Well, first I'll illustrate how I feel, which is that I do feel all the healthcare workers deserve a very sincere applause for the work they're doing. So I'm going to join in.
Normally I do multiple blasts, but for the sake of our conversation, I'll come back. So I know you, we talked about that very briefly before we began, but you had a different take on what was going on at 7 p.m.
Yeah, so I'll say number one, which is that I'm much more in the applause category than the banging on pots and pans category. For me, it reminds me a bit of the Purim festivities.
Sure.
As Jews, we get together every year, and basically it's a very kind of festive and carnival type holiday. And this type of noise is not as much an applause that you would hear at the end of a symphony. It's much more of kind of a loud jeering. It reminds me a bit of waving the groggers around and yelling whenever you hear the name of Haman.
Right. Noise making, not applause.
Noise making, not applause. And my second opinion is that potentially it becomes a bit tiring for the whole community, and it loses its impact to do it every single day. I feel immensely grateful for all of the healthcare workers, and I also feel that our applause is really cheap. I mean, we shouldn't be sending them to die without protective equipment. And I
Absolutely.
think what's being asked in a lot of hospitals is basically, you're a nurse, this is your living, but because of the crisis, you're expected to basically go put yourself in very dangerous positions. And all the science has shown that doctors and nurses have a much higher chance of dying to the disease because of the amount of exposure they're receiving.
Right.
And so I don't necessarily love the juxtaposition of kind of the carnival noises we make at 7 p.m. while we're sending these people off to die in the night shift.
Yeah.
And so number one, I applaud them, and I do join the applause every night, but
Right.
I think that with the applause, we should also be looking at what they're doing, what's being asked of them. These people are doctors and nurses. I don't necessarily think when they signed up for it that they thought it was the same thing as being a Marine.
Right.
And so many of them probably don't want to die on this hill, and they want to help people. That's how they make their living. That's also something that they obviously, care deeply about. But if they die, it's not helping anybody.
Right.
And I think that the media has been painting these people as martyrs. When I see, like a surgeon with 20 years of training who's dying due to coronavirus, I don't see that as a martyr. I see that as a very tragic and avoidable loss, that if we had let him take 2 weeks off of work, potentially that highly skilled surgeon would still be with us and still be able to save lives.
Yeah. It's a complicated equation because you take that surgeon off to protect them, but then they in turn can't protect 10, 20 people who they would have
Right.
seen otherwise. It's an impossible equation, but it's one that I'd like to get to actually a little later. But we can jump into it now. There's no reason. So you were an econ major in
I
college,
was.
which is interesting to me because there's a lot of talk right now about when is the right time to open non-essential SMBs, small to medium-sized businesses, and other closed businesses, and it's this cost between money and the economy versus potential human lives if this would spread further. So that's another very difficult balancing act. So I'm curious, what are your thoughts on that?
I have many. So I'm glad you asked.
Of
I
course.
mean, what I'm seeing with the crisis is, I think right now, in its current state, it's more of an economic crisis than a medical science crisis.
Mm.
And the reason I say that is because ultimately the cure for this will be through medical science. It will be through developing a vaccine or developing an antiviral drug treatment.
Right.
But currently, the crisis that we find ourselves in is a lack of resources. We have a huge demand for these resources, and we have a finite supply, which is the root of economics. So specifically, those resources are protective equipment. Those resources are doctors and nurses, hospital beds, ventilators.
Yep.
Those resources are coronavirus tests. We'd be a lot better. Everyone says the only way we can really go towards some sort of reopening is if we had many, many, many more testing facilities than we have now.
Yeah.
So I've been looking at this whole crisis from my perspective. I'm seeing all these kind of issues of resource allocation, resource availability. Regarding the macro economy, which is what I think a lot of people talk about, first I'll tell you where I think, and this is probably a highly charged statement, but I'm just going to go for it because I was told that this is not a censored show.
It's not.
I'll
Go
tell
for it.
you where I think some right-wing pundits are coming from, which is that I was always taught in the kind of more holistic school of economics that I was trained in, that it's about value, creating value, that a human life obviously has immeasurable value over the span of its duration. And that therefore, if you look at the macroeconomy, preserving lives is one of the best things you can do, both in terms of the skill investment that those workers have, that they're able to contribute, as well as just the body count, having more work to make more ideas and do more arts and crafts and do more manual labor and all those things. And once you lose a life, I mean, the incubation period to go from an embryo to a skilled tradesman is a very long time.
Yeah.
It takes a generation.
Yeah.
So once you lose a life, it's very hard to replace. That being said, I think that on the right side of the economic spectrum, you have a lot of people who fall into kind of the Malthusian camp. Malthus, not exactly sure on all my details of this, but essentially, from what I understand, he was a religious figure of sorts back in the day, as well as a theorist and economist. And basically, he pointed out that population growth happens exponentially, but there's a finite amount of land and resources. And so when people talk about Malthusian economics, it's basically the concept of overpopulation being a bad thing because we only have so many resources to get spread out to everyone. You know, the earth only has so much copper, so much land to grow food.
Right.
So I think that a lot of people who are saying, you know, we need to get the economy up and running again, kind of have the opinion that if a few people die, especially, I would imagine they have an inherent bias that they won't be among those that die.
Yeah.
That probably the 3% who die are going to be, you know, the poor urban masses.
Right.
That they'll be able to hide out in their house somewhere. I mean, I heard of wealthy people buying private ventilators and keeping nurses on retainer.
Yeah.
And so I have a feeling that when they think about the economy, they kind of have this somewhat twisted, although somewhat valid perspective of if 3% of people died, then the earth would be a bit less crowded. And
Right.
I could go back to buying assets a bit more cheaply, and I could have a bit more breathing room in the park when I'm doing my yoga.
Yeah.
And so I think that's where people are coming from. I already stated why I wouldn't necessarily agree with that, why I think that there is, you know, fundamental economic value in people's lives and
Yeah.
keeping people alive.
Absolutely.
And I think that another thing to be thought about is that even if the restrictions on reopening things are lifted from a legal perspective, that you're not going to have the same demand because there are people who are going to be worried for their health and who are not going to be going to restaurants
Right.
and bars, etc.
Totally.
So that being said, I don't actually think that reopening or not reopening from the legal perspective makes that much of a difference, because I do think that inherently this is a man versus nature problem.
Mm.
And, you know, you can say the beach is open or the beach is closed, but if the beach is flooded, no one's going to be on the beach.
That's well said.
So that's kind of my opinion on this essentially regarding the best thing for the economy. I know that a lot of people are hurting right now. I mean, there's people who are directly impacted from this, and then there are people who are indirectly impacted, but who maybe they had some clients in their industry who were directly impacted. So we're definitely in a recession. Everything right now is receding. The, you know, things that used to be justifiable in terms of costs are no longer justifiable. People are basically making their spending choices more efficient, which is
Mm.
what a recession is. We're not in a growth period.
Right.
And to be honest, I think we need to accept the recession. Recessions can be good every once in a while. They tend to happen about every 8 to 10 years. I think that it's a bit like a forest fire where it kind of burns the dry undergrowth and gives people a bit more confidence in the future.
Yeah.
I know for the last few years, a lot of people have not had a lot of confidence in the future because they've said we've been on this huge bull run.
Right.
The numbers seem uninflated. I think the Dow Jones went up something like 30% last year, which is not normal.
Right.
And so people were starting to say, you know, when's the next crisis? I heard a quote that it's not about the sharpness of the needle, it's about the size of the bubble. And I think that's what we're seeing here, is that we were in a very inflated economy, and that the coronavirus was essentially the needle that popped it.
Mm.
So I think a bit of a recession is not necessarily an unhealthy thing, but going back to the forest fire analogy, you experienced a forest fire in your own life,
Certainly did.
and it's perhaps a natural phenomenon, but it needs to be A, it needs to be well handled and well
Yeah.
reacted to by the government, and B, it needs to be not exacerbated
Yeah.
by policies.
Yes.
And so what I think is the problem right now is that we're facing a recession, but we're facing a recession with a highly incompetent government that, A, over the last 4 years, through their basically keeping interest rates rock bottom, even though, you know, according to classical economic theory, and this is fairly right-wing theory, you're supposed to bring interest rates up during positive economic times in order to counteract the growth, basically in order to save up so that you can drop them when things get bad.
Right.
And I think anyone who really knows their stuff can look at the Trump economy and see that there were a lot of shortcuts taken in order to essentially inflate the stock market, not the economy and not the health of the economy as a whole.
Right.
Which is interesting because I think that, you know, I'm definitely part of the stock owning class. I have a 401k. My parents have a 401k and they have, you know, investments. I think that would apply to you as well. but it's a huge source of inequality because the majority of the country does not own any stocks.
Yeah.
And so when we measure the wealth of the country based on the wealth of the stock market,
Hmm.
you see that it's fundamentally a misguided way of assessing the wealth of the country, because not only does the majority of the country not own stocks, the proportion of stocks that I own and that you own are nothing compared to the people who really benefited. I mean,
Right.
for some people, a 30% increase in the Dow Jones is, billions of dollars.
Right. Right.
And so I think that right now we're kind of to make the forest fire analogy, just like the fires were much worse because of the dryness and the drought that had been caused by global warming. Right now, the panic and the crisis we're in is much, much worse because we hadn't been saving money. It's possible, for instance, under the Clinton administration, I think in Germany, they do this where when the economy is good, they reduce the deficit.
Yeah.
I don't know the exact numbers, but I believe that Trump basically doubled the deficit, whatever it was under Obama.
Yeah.
So the point is that we're in a crisis of our own making, and that this recession, unfortunately, is not necessarily a healthy thing for the economy because of the lack of an intelligent response to it. And when I say that, I mean, if you look at all the money we're spending now on the stimulus, I'm personally part of the camp that we need to send that money to the people who are hurting by not having jobs right now, not necessarily to the job creators, who generally have a bit more savings saved up. And through the way the legal system works, often it's the bigger corporations anyway that are able to get more of the funds.
Yeah.
But number two is that we really kind of spent all of our backup plans just trying to boost the stock market. And now we're in for a bit of a reckoning, unfortunately. And I don't think, mandating that the economy remains open or mandating that the economy remains closed is really substantively going to change anything.
Right. Right. Because the recession just fundamentally changes demand, and, whether or not the restaurant is open doesn't really change so much.
Yes, exactly. There's
The
still going
only,
to be people that don't want to spend money at the restaurant because they're worried, maybe they got a pay cut, or there's
right.
going to be people that don't want to go there because of the virus.
Right.
And generally recessions are natural things that happen, but I can't stress the forest fire analogy. It's much worse if all the wood's dried out and you pretend it doesn't exist and you don't send the firefighters to the places where they need to be.
Right. I guess the thought is, at least if the restaurants were open, they could earn something. They could sort of retool for the current recession, right? They could try to focus more on takeout or lower prices, try to do more volume, things of that nature.
So going back to the crisis of economics here, I think that the solution forward would have to be in mass testing.
Yeah.
Because people like me and people who have felt sick, I mean, I read that at this point, New York is approaching close to 1 million cases of coronavirus.
Wow.
So could we reopen the economy? I mean, theoretically, if, people have talked about basically a badge that says I have the antibodies, and things could, in a limited capacity, open back up, but it's a crisis right now of not having the resources. We would need much more testing than we have now. And then we have an administration that is, rather than, putting their minds towards solving that crisis of resources, they're basically saying, oh, we need to reopen.
Yeah.
And so unfortunately, there are steps we could be taking towards the ultimate kind of, everyone wants to see the rainbow shining and the crisis to be over.
Yeah.
But acting like the crisis doesn't exist and acting like measures that we've taken to react to the crisis are the source of the damage, I think it's only going to exacerbate it and make it worse.
Yeah. Yeah. No, certainly, I think the actions that have been taken to try to mitigate this thing have been good. I mean, especially in New York or California with Cuomo and Governor Newsom, who I think have been doing a fairly good job considering the resources.
Right. Going back to my own experience, I mean, I felt immensely more comfortable knowing that if in that third week my lungs stopped working, that there would be hospital beds open for me.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And so this whole, like I said, I think people who suggest that don't consider themselves among the 3%.
You cut out for a little bit there, the first half of that last phrase.
I think you caught my intentions. I was
Okay.
basically saying that those who say let them die don't think it's let us die. It's let them.
Right. It's let a specific class of people die, hopefully all the sick criminals, that's what they have twisted in their head, but unfortunately it doesn't work like that, right?
Right.
We let this thing out. It's an equal opportunity killer.
That's why I said it's really man versus nature, and I think people have kind of forgotten what the nature of those conflicts is like.
Yeah.
In the American tradition, we love talking about our conflicts. World War II, the Cold War, Vietnam. It's us versus the enemy, and people are looking at it, they're saying, how can we bomb the enemy and declare victory? It doesn't work like that.
Yeah.
Nature is always going to be the most dangerous thing out there. And I think this is potentially a wake-up call, that I'm very passionate about the climate and preserving, a world that we can live on in 50 years, that our grandchildren can live on.
Yeah.
And I think it's the same thing that people forget, your politics doesn't matter. Playing the blame game doesn't matter. Your policies, don't really matter. At the end of the day, like, we are slaves to our environment, and if the earth starts giving us more hurricanes, there isn't really anything you can do about that except to suffer and to take the damage. And so when people are talking about the recession and the economic damage, like, it's not because of the policies, it's because there's a virus going around that has fundamentally changed the situation.
Right. And we're so poorly prepared for it, in part because we don't really think this kind of way. We're not used to approaching this kind of enemy. We haven't had one like this in a long time that's really been this serious.
Right. And then I also think, going back to, we're not used to approaching this type of enemy, that I see an analogy with the climate, because just like Corona, the science was there.
Yeah.
And they were able to make the forecasts, and you could argue about the accuracy of the forecasts, but the forecasts are not just forecasts. They're backed in theory. They're backed in experiments that show that methane in the air increases temperature, that high carbon systems have more heat.
Yeah.
And so you have a solid theory that is backed by not only evidence in the data, but also, very compelling forecasts. But because people can't reckon with it right away, because they can't kind of wrestle with it and bomb it,
right,
it's very hard to convince people that, just like Corona, my dad will cough and occasionally not cover his mouth, and I'll say, you're spreading germs. He doesn't see them.
right.
And people will drive their car, and you say, oh, you're killing the planet. They don't see it.
But where am I killing?
It's very hard to fight kind of an invisible enemy, especially one that has a bit of a lag.
Yes.
Where 20 years from now, like, there's nothing we can do really, because it's such a problem that, just like Corona, like, once it's out there, it's out there.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so it's very hard to convince people to take the steps they need to before they can see the damage.
Absolutely.
Which is a bit of a curse, of humanity. I'm sure if you looked at history, it's not the first time.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's one of the reasons this spreads so much, and it's one of the reasons why climate change was able to get to the point that it did, because it doesn't get, until it starts to get really serious and really affect people, too late. You've
Right.
lost the chance to act. You can still act to a certain degree, but it's all about flattening the curve, right? It's all about mitigating the damage.
Right.
Already on, rolling downhill.
Right. And then going back to kind of the pundits and the various views that are circulating right now, I think there's a lot of people that kind of want us to get to the end game, essentially, to push us to the point of no return, so that they can say, oh, well, the virus is already out there, we need to reopen. Or, oh, carbon emissions are already so high, we need to build the flood walls. And you see that strategy. I studied game theory, so I understand basically you can play your hand and then force your opponent. Sad to describe other Americans as opponents, but you can force them to basically react in their best interest by setting the game in a certain direction.
Right.
And, you see that, for instance, in my opinion, with the government of Bibi Netanyahu, where he's saying, let's just build these settlements now, and eventually they're going to need to, like, recognize the situation on the ground that this is Israeli territory.
Right.
And that's basically what Exxon did, where I was talking to a scientist who said in the 70s he was advocating climate change. I said, how did you become passionate about this in the 70s? He said, at the time, we were using computers to build weather models, and it was clear as day once we started plugging the numbers in that we were headed towards a crisis. So now it's 2020. This is 50 years later. And now what you're hearing more and more of is, how can we stop temperatures from rising more than 2 degrees Celsius?
Right.
So it's no longer about, well, we need to live in harmony with the earth. It's, well, now we've trashed everything, so let's build Wall-E robots to clean up the trash.
Yeah. Yeah. No, well said. I think it's absolutely true. It's a sorry state of affairs, unfortunately, but I mean, we just have to look at the bright side and what we can do and the resources that we do have, and hopefully doing hopefully doing something positive from everything that's sort of unearthed and discovered through this. All of those inequities and inequalities throughout the system of our society. Now that they're being exposed, let's do something that is meaningful and impactful and can hopefully shape and improve our future.
Hopefully, I think if there's any bright side to this, I mean, look, I said the same thing when Trump was elected, which is actually a quote by Jefferson. He says, "If two idiots are running for office, let the other side win." And I'm not sure that it's played out so well in American politics over the last 4 years.
Yeah.
But hopefully, with any crisis, at the end of it, you'll have people realizing the more fundamental values. Like I said about a recession, ultimately it's not an unhealthy thing for an economy to go through. It's people
Right.
saying,
Natural.
it's natural. Maybe I didn't need two cars, maybe I needed one. Maybe we didn't actually need 1,000 employees because we had an entire sales division that wasn't really producing any value. Maybe we need 800 employees.
Absolutely.
So it's natural, and it can, renew faith in the future and help us to go for a better path. I hope that we can get there.
Hope so.
Unfortunately, I think that one of the issues right now with everything, I mean, when I say everything, I mean life in the world over the last 10 years, is that the internet is a very new force. And I think that recently there has been a lot of, strategic disinformation campaigns over the internet.
Yes.
And if you read the Mueller report, it's pretty shocking and it's pretty explicit how it details everything that Russia was doing. But I doubt Russia is the only player.
Right.
And right now, it's unfortunate that the internet was supposed to be a tool to connect all of us, but instead it's being used to actively spread false information and to polarize people. And it's taking every single crisis and every single political event, and it's making it into a conflict. It's making
Right.
artificial conflicts. The
Right.
fact that Trump was not impeached and that Nixon was, I think, shows you how polarizing things have become.
Yes, absolutely.
And
Yeah.
having read up on what happened in the 2016 election, I don't think that was. I do think, to take the positive, I do think that was because of the internet.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's a fair point to make. I mean, it's certainly the internet in certain cases, such as the ones you're talking about, has been weaponized to, exacerbate differences or create differences where there weren't even differences.
Right.
And, it's a shame. And that's part of the reason I've been doing this COVID chats program. One, to keep me sane, to see people I know and talk with them. And then two, to try to spread some positivity through the internet, some real conversations, harness our empathy and togetherness and create something that is worthwhile.
You can always talk to me without recording.
we do plenty of times, but thank you for coming on the program. I really appreciate it. The quarantine beard is looking fantastic.
Thank you. Let me zoom in for a second. I'll show you. I didn't know that I had this genetic trait, but apparently I have a double pronged.
I like that. Excellent.
Yeah, I can kind of run my thumb.
That's beautiful. That's I'm sure the guests and the viewers will greatly enjoy that.
Viewers at home, check for a double pronged beard.
Yeah, check for the double prong. Well, thank you again. Really appreciate it. Hope you have a wonderful dinner, a good evening, and I hope you continue to heal and feel better. And hopefully we can see each other soon.
Thank you. Same to you. And my farewell will be that I hope that everyone who has the virus can be as fortunate as I was to not end up in the hospital.
Absolutely.
And my heart goes out there to anyone who's currently fighting it, or to anyone who's currently, fearing getting it and fighting that that it can stay healthy and positive and pleasure. Thank you.
Absolutely. Stay safe.